Good afternoon at Speaker's Corner. Today is Easter Sunday, and hooray! And churches throughout the world are proclaiming a simple three-word message: Christ is risen. The Pope did it this morning. My good Christian friend here has been doing it this morning. All the churches throughout the world have got the same message: that a man 2,000 years ago rose from the dead on this Sunday, not on Good Friday, not on Saturday, but on this day 2,000 years ago. And as a Muslim, I obviously want to offer my reflections on that, because I don't believe that Jesus bodily rose from the dead. I don't believe the scriptures foretold it, and I don't believe it happened historically. But anyway, sorry, I'm now entering into polemics, so I'll now draw a line over that. That's it, end of my introduction, and I've now got 5 minutes, we've agreed beforehand, but I'll give my bit, and then my good friend here will give his response. I'm very liberal about this. If he wants more than 2 minutes, I'm not going to complain about it, to be honest.
So essentially what I am suggesting is that he'll do 5 minutes advancing his case, and I'll take 2 minutes just critiquing his case. He'll do 5 more minutes on his case, 2 more minutes critiquing, and then I'll take my 5 minutes advancing my case, where he can critique only for 2 minutes, and then 5-2. So it's 5-2, 5-2, and then 5-2, 5-2.
And Douglas has a PhD in mathematics. If none of that is clear, he will make that clearer for us.
It's a long time ago. I've forgotten it all.
We'll manage.
He's fired.
We'll manage.
Right,
So
are we ready? Action. Okay, go. Alright, so I just want to share with you what the earliest first-person witness to the resurrection of Jesus, the appearance of the resurrected Jesus, tells us. This comes in a letter from St. Paul, in the letter of the Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 3 onwards. Now, here's the earliest first-person account.
Why have you got that bit highlighted in yellow, Mr. Speaker?
Oh dear. First-person account we have in the Bible of a resurrection appearance. And I want to tell you what he said before we go on to other matters. And he says this: "For I hand on to you as of first importance what I in turn received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures."
I don't think that's the King James version, is it?
And then he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to someone untimely born, he appeared also to me, for I am the least of the apostles. So he says, out of that long series of appearances, he also appeared to Paul. Now my point is this today. I'll make two essential points really. One is, where in the Scriptures, now what are the Scriptures? The Scriptures are the Jewish Bible. It begins in Genesis, goes all the way up to Malachi in the Protestant Bible.
It's not called Bible, it's called Torah.
Okay. And I want to know where...
Jesus isn't his name, by the way.
Okay.
Jesus is Greek, it means son of Zeus.
Thank you. You're very learned.
Thank you.
Can I just try my own Paul
Joshua, son of Joseph.
Right.
The horse shop in use.
Although I'm not as learned as this man, I will continue in my own Paul way to have a go at this debate.
Very modest Paul.
I'm also being sarcastic. You recognise that? Just give me 10 extra seconds for the interruption. Well, okay. My point is this: where in the Jewish Bible, that includes the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, does it say that the Christ, that's the Messiah in Hebrew, would die for sins and then be raised on the third day, according to the Jewish script? That's what it says in here. That's my first question to any Christian, to this gentleman here. Where does it say the Messiah would die and be raised on the third day? That's my first question, my first point, if you like. And secondly, what about the resurrection appearances themselves? This is what Paul says of them in Acts. And he's talking to King Agrippa. He's been arrested, he's going off ultimately to Rome to be martyred. And he says, "After that, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision." This heavenly vision, if you look at the preceding verses, refers to the appearance of Jesus on the road to Damascus, where Jesus appears to him and says, "Why are you persecuting me, Paul? You know, I'm Jesus." Paul calls the appearance of the resurrected Jesus to him a vision, a heavenly vision. Now the people who were with him saw nothing. An important point of evidence. The resurrected Jesus appears to an apostle of God, and the apostle himself, the people who were with him, saw nothing. And remember, this is supposed to be a bodily resurrection, a resurrection from the dead, and yet no one saw anything apart from Paul, who had a heavenly vision. So I would maintain, and remember the Gospels are written, the Gospels were written maybe 40, 50, 60 years after Paul said they were heavenly vision to King Agrippa, they were written much, much longer afterwards, where I would argue the story had become embellished, had developed, had become mythologized. So what started off as a vision, like the vision of Mary or the vision of whoever, Vishnu, whatever you want to call it, people have visions all the time in religious history. Even today people have visions. I'm not doubting that Paul had a vision, but this is the resurrected Christ that we are celebrating today. And it was a vision, the people with him saw nothing. So I maintain that it started off as a vision. It became, in the retelling of the story, year after year, decade after decade, eventually, when it was set down in the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, it became a very physical story. But it wasn't originally. So my twofold challenge is, where does the Jewish Bible say the Messiah would die and be raised on the third day? Because I have read all of the Bible, every book of the Bible a number of times. I've personally never come across this. Maybe this learned brother can put me right today and show me where it says that. Hopefully. And secondly, does he agree with Paul that the resurrection appearances were in fact visions initially, and as the story got told they became physicalized, embellished, mythologized? And I'm going to give up my last 30 seconds. I've said what I want to say. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for this opportunity. So, Paul has raised two specific points in regards to resurrection. The first point he has raised is that, of course, the New Testament talks about Christ having died and Christ rising up on the third day according to the Hebrew scriptures. So Paul's challenge is, where in the Hebrew scriptures do you find the resurrection having been prophesied, and especially the resurrection on the third day? All right. The answer is pretty simple, and the answer has been provided quite explicitly in the book of Acts. In the preaching of Peter, in the book of Acts, chapter 2, Peter quite clearly talks about this. Acts chapter 2, verse 27, where Peter refers to an Old Testament prophecy which says, "For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of joy in your presence." So Peter answered Paul's question a long time ago, soon after resurrection. But Peter points out to a prophecy which is in the book of Psalms. In the book of Psalms, chapter 16, verses 8 to 11, where the psalmist says, "I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will rest in hope. For you will not leave my soul in Sheol." That's the prophecy.
So which psalm is that? Sorry. Psalm which 15?
16.
Beg your pardon. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, that's fine. So, prophecy about resurrection right there. Jonah, third day, coming back from Sheol. Two specific prophecies put together on the third day, resurrection in the Old Testament. Paul, now I haven't got much time, just a few more seconds if I may take. This our Paul essentially said, Apostle Paul just had a vision. I have a problem. I have many points in regard to that, but I'll just raise one point for the lack of time here, which is, how can a vision blind a person? Paul was blinded, and the blind Paul was taken into the city, and when he was inside the city, when he was prayed, scales fell off his eyes. Now, is that a vision? Or is that a real blindness with a real scale falling off his eyes for him to regain his sight? Very important. Not a spiritual vision, but a physical reality in Paul's life. Blindness followed by scales falling off, followed by being able to see again. Physical resurrection is what, physical experience is what Paul had.
Paul. Okay, lovely. Thank you for that. Yeah. Psalm 16, let's have a look at it. I've got it's not a Muslim Bible, by the way, it's a Holy Bible, the New Revised Standard Version. It's a standard academic Bible, which I used at university when I was studying the New Testament, recommended by most academics in Britain and America recommend this translation. The most accurate translation. Let's look at Psalm 16. It says, a Psalm of David. So we know that the speaker here is David. He says this. Remember the question, by the way, where does it say in the Jewish Bible that the Messiah, or the Christ, would die and then be raised again on the third day. Have that statement in the forefront of your mind, and let's see if it is found in Psalm 16, as my good friend here says. So that's the challenge. Let me read it to you in this very good translation of David. Protect me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to God, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the holy ones in the land, they are noble, in whom is all my delight. Whom choose another God, multiply their sorrows. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names upon my lips. The Lord is upon my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. I have a goodly heritage. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night he instructs me. I keep the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. For you do not give me up to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit. You show me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore. End of Psalm. End of Psalm. Where does it say in that psalm that the Messiah would die and on the third day be raised again from the dead? It doesn't mention a Messiah. No one actually dies in this. It is, you have not abandoned me to Sheol. It's a poetic figure of speech. It doesn't say he'd be risen again on the third day. It certainly doesn't say, as Paul also says of the scriptures, that it says the Messiah would die for sin. It doesn't say that either. So I'm afraid that this challenge has not been met so far. It doesn't mention a Messiah, death, 3 days, or resurrection, or anything else. It's just David saying, thank you, God, for being faithful to me. It's a great psalm and nothing to do with Christian belief, in my view. Secondly, to come back to the resurrection appearances, these are supposedly our physical bodily appearances, as solid as we are here today, where you can actually touch and see the physical Jesus. And yet, according to the earliest account we have, the people who were with Paul, the Apostle Paul, saw nothing as Paul was having the vision of the resurrected Jesus. This is damnable evidence that the earliest resurrection appearance was not a physical appearance. It cannot have been physical unless everyone else was blind in the first place.
He's a character.
So I come back to the 2 points I made.
Got too much coffee.
I've yet to hear a prophecy in the Old Testament that Christ died on the third day, rose from the dead.
Huh?
And why did no one in Paul's entourage see anything? You mentioned the scales falling by the light. That's not my point. The point is, it was a physical bodily resurrection. No, why did no one see with Paul a physically bodily resurrected Jesus? You would expect to see it if it was a bodily resurrection. So I'll give up my last 2 minutes, but I've said my piece.
All right. Paul, our friend Paul here, seemed to undermine King David so much. Any Jew who would know about the Messiah would very, very strongly object to that. Because Messiah, according to Jewish scriptures, is seen as a Davidic king. Messiah, according to Jewish scriptures, as a matter of fact, by Jews today even, the Messiah himself is actually called as David or Davidic Messiah also. In other words, the Messiah is very, very tightly seen with David, King David himself. Now, adding to that, let's read specifically the 2 verses I care about in this regard, which is verses 9 and 10, where David saying something which doesn't really apply to his life directly. Let's see what he says. My flesh also will rest in hope, for you will not leave my soul in Sheol. David says his soul will not be left in Sheol. And then he goes on, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. Which Holy One was David himself talking about? If the Holy Messiah is much more than David, and David is, let's say, a top guy in Jewish ideas. The point is this, my dear friends, David is referring to the one above him, the one far more superior to him, who is the Messiah himself. Talking about the Messiah, he says, The Holy One will not see corruption. What is he talking about? Even if his body dies, the body will not completely be corrupted, but it will come back. That was David's point. I can't see why our friend Paul here doesn't see that point. Now, he also went back again to Paul's, Apostle Paul's vision on the road to Damascus. We need to look at two things there. Number one, Paul had a physical implication because of what he saw. The idea is that he had a physical implication, number one. How can you say something to be a dream or just a mere vision when someone is blinded because of that? Add to that, Paul has that same narration, not in just one place, but in 2 or 3 separate places. We need to combine all of them together to get a conclusion. My 2 minutes is over now. So my conclusion is, Paul, physical blindness, and therefore something which happened in physical reality. Not a dream, not a vision.
Right, so that's 5-2-5-2. No, it's the other way. 5-2-5-2. Yeah?
Okay.
Another 5 minutes now.
Yeah.
I get 5 minutes, you can critique my case.
No, fine. I mean, if you're happy to just carry on, we've been talking about 2 minutes. Okay, carry on. Okay, I want to answer your point, sir. It doesn't seem natural to not answer your point.
We can, but the point is, if we keep on arguing like that, we won't proceed much. So I need to advance my case here also.
Advance away.
So,
Avance!
I'll have to come back to your points then later on.
after we do 5
I think
we can.
Okay.
Now, I'd like to present a few, this is my 5 minutes where Paul would critique my case. I'd like to present a few very important things in Jesus' life. Very important things in Jesus' life. And here I present that in tabular form. And I'll read that out to you also, which is, Jesus is a very popular Jewish name, but to speak about a very particular Jesus, the Jesus we care about, the Bible talks about that specific Jesus, whose brother was James, whose father was Joseph, mother was Mary, and so on. Gives additional details, and more importantly, this particular Jesus is uniquely identified by him being called the Christ. And that particular Jesus having disciples, extravagant claims about himself, new teaching, not just the Old Testament, but New Testament. Jesus himself said, I've come to give new wine in new wineskin. And then this Jesus did signs and wonders, miracles. In the day and age when people were even led to think the Messiah would never die, he would just live forever, where dying Messiah is an alien idea, this Jesus was accused, this Jesus offended Jewish leadership, and the Jewish leadership retaliated by planning to destroy him. The Jewish leadership accused him, and they took Jesus to the Romans, for the Romans to condemn him, and finally he was crucified. Now, when Jesus was crucified, the Bible also says nature itself responded to the crucifixion. And also later on, disciples come to believe in Jesus' resurrection. Disciples worship Jesus. And the early church was persecuted for all that we spoke about right now, especially for the fact of the disciples worshipping this person who they also claim to have died, who have been buried, and who rose up again back to life. And the early church grew right in Jerusalem, right beginning in the 1st century. Now, for these specific 16 points I raised, the Christian Gospels give detailed accounts. But add to the Christian Gospels in secular historical artifacts, and I've listed down numbers which I've given for them in my examination, we find secular historical artifacts attesting to every single point I have raised thus far. Amongst them, every single point addressed by secular historical artifacts also. In other words, for the particular Jesus of the Gospels who we read about, who I claim to be God, there is a very clear non-Christian historical attestation also for the same story. Put both of them together. To deny Jesus Christ's death and resurrection is to deny some of the fundamental aspects we know about human history. And therefore, my dear friends, may I please commend to you, we need to grapple with the historical records which are at our disposal. Christian, Jewish, Roman, Greek, and to just name a few there. I'm perusing the following sources: Tacitus, Annals, chapter 15, verse 44, Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, book number 20, 9.1, Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, 3.3, Pliny the Younger, Epistles, 10, 96, 25, Suetonius, The Lives of the 12 Caesars, book 5, 25.4, Suetonius, The Lives of 12 Caesars, book 6, 16.2, Lucian of Samosata, The Passing of Peregrinus, his work, Celsus, a Platonist philosopher, Babylonian Talmud, Thales, Phlegon, Africanus, Jonathan ben Uziel, writing the Targum, Jonathan. Put all of these things together, the Jesus of the Gospels could very easily be identified even without reading the Gospels. Not that I recommend you to do that, but even without reading the Gospels, you can construct the entire crux of Jesus' life quite clearly. We all need to come back to Jesus Christ, who alone is able to save you and save me.
Amen.
Thank you.
Wow, very impressive. Thank you for that. So I get 2 minutes in response. Okay, let's just remind ourselves of the 2 points that I made initially. I'm going to Paul. I'm not going to anywhere else like Josephus or Suetonius or Tacitus or all the list of other people. None of them claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus. The earliest one in the New Testament, in the first person account, is Paul. None of the other witnesses are witnesses really. These are later people who have never even been to Jerusalem, most of these people. So what did our earliest witness say? He said in the 2 points, just to refresh our memories, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Jewish scriptures, and that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Jewish scriptures. And my friend here, as we know, about 7 minutes ago, exactly 7 minutes ago, went back to Psalm 16 to prove this from the Psalm. And although I wish him well, I'm afraid he has failed completely to provide that evidence. The bit about the Holy One can also be translated the faithful one, as it is in the NRSV. And it's in the first person. David says, therefore my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. For you do not give me up to Sheol. You do not give me up to Sheol. David is speaking about himself. It is not a prophecy of a future event. He's not talking about the Messiah. It's not a future resurrection from the grave. It's a poetic way of saying, you did not give me over to darkness or to evil. Okay, David is speaking in the first person, so that obviously cannot be a prophecy. Secondly, I will just read the passage in Acts where Paul says that people with him saw nothing. Remember, this is a bodily resurrection allegedly, but in Acts chapter 9, verse 7, the men who were travelling with him stood speechless because they heard a voice, but they saw no one. The Christian claim is that there was a bodily resurrection of Jesus, but in fact it was a vision in the subjective mind of Paul, and no one with him saw a thing. Therefore, it did not happen as a bodily resurrection. That is my case.
Okay, I recommend it to our dear friend Paul that he'd have 5 minutes to advance his case, and now is the turn where I'm advancing my case. I expected Paul to critique my case, not advance his own case, which hasn't happened unfortunately. But just to quickly comment, Paul, our friend Paul here, comfortably just missed out the portion of scriptures I very much care about, which is beyond. David said, for you will not leave my soul in Sheol, I agree, but he went on to say, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption.
Which verse?
Nor, the same verse, the second half. 10. Nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption.
Oh, yeah.
Crucial part. How can, say, obviously David was talking about a case where the person could be corrupted but he is not allowed to see that corruption. And that is Davidic description of the body being in the grave, which is very qualified to be corrupt, but which was not allowed to be corrupt, just like how it happened in the case of not David. It didn't happen in the case of David. David saw corruption, and that was the entire Apostle Peter's case. And therefore, this must be a prophecy from David. Now moving on to my case. Paul comfortably ignored the case that I advanced.
Sorry, we're just going to argue about how long you're having. Are you having 5 minutes again now?
You have 2 lots of 5 minutes.
Sorry,
This is the second lot.
give me an extra 10 minutes. Is there 10 seconds? Sorry, apologies for interrupting. I got confused.
That's fine. Now, Paul comfortably ignored the case that I was trying to advance here. I'd like him to critique the case I'm advancing. Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Josephus, these are the people I'd like Paul to speak about. Now, nowhere did I say these people were direct witnesses. Nowhere did I say that. For instance, Tacitus was a Roman senator who lived between 56 and 118 AD. Of course, he was born after Jesus ascended up to the heaven, but he was a Roman senator who had Roman records at his disposal. And that Tacitus, with the Roman records available to him, testifies, and he says, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea. 2 things I'd like to point out. Someone who had access to resources talks about 2 specific things here. Number 1, he testified that Jesus was killed, undergone death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of procurator Pontius Pilatus. Jesus was certainly killed.
Yes.
And he goes on to talk about something which he terms as pernicious superstition. Pernicious superstition. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease. Pernicious superstition, which he describes as a disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a walk. Now, the context is this. Tacitus wasn't just a Roman senator. History also tells us that Tacitus was a Roman priest. I can give you details. In AD 88, Tacitus became a member of the board of 15 for performing sacrifices atop an elite club of priests. And Tacitus was one of those 15 elite priests in the Roman way of worshipping God. Now, what would someone who has his own pantheistic worldview, all sorts of gods, stones are gods, trees are gods, all sorts of created things are gods, woods are God, and so on, for him to speak about something as pernicious superstition? We would term his ideas as superstition. But that man claims, in his view, whatever happened to Jesus, or whatever was claimed by the Christians themselves, was pernicious superstition. He didn't stop there. He even termed that as a disease. And I'd like to comment before you, my dear friends, the exotic resurrection in the eyes of even a Roman priest would look a bit far-fetched. And that's precisely what Tacitus was testifying about. In the 1st century, Tacitus records this specific pernicious superstition began in Judea, was checked briefly in Judea, but later on broke out, going into the rest of the world also. My dear friends, resurrection employed to me by Tacitus, but certainly crucifixion. That's the kind of historical records I'd like our friend Paul to deal with. Not ignore, not ridicule, deal with it, please.
Over to you. Poor Paul.
I get sometimes. Okay. 2 points really. I'll just come back to your revisiting of Psalm 16 verse 10 and read it here again. Remember, the first person, the author, the speaker is David, King David, no one else. It says in verse 10, "For you did not give me up to Sheol." You didn't give me up to Sheol. It's not a future prophecy. It's not talking about anyone else. It's not talking about Jesus. Thousands of years later, you did not give me up to Sheol, nor let your faithful one see the pit. So in the third person. So he's talking about himself. It's not a prophecy. I think that effectively deals with that. Now, coming back to the other people he mentioned, Tacitus, Suetonius, etc., this just proves nothing. Maybe it's a misunderstanding here. I'm not denying that there are some Christians who believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That was the Christian message. Paul testifies to it, and that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. I'm not denying that that belief existed. So Tacitus, in the 2nd century, is reporting that this pernicious superstition occurred in the empire. I don't dispute that. I accept that. It's a matter of historical record. My point is entirely different from any of these hearsay accounts written by people after the lifetime of Paul and Jesus. I want to go back to Paul himself, who claims to be an eyewitness of what? Of a vision. Did other people see the vision? No. But he says, and I'll read this again, that this vision appeared to more than 500 brothers. Then the vision appeared to James. Then it appeared, last of all, as to someone untimely born, the vision appeared to me. He had a vision. People had visions of Mary. They believe they're very real. At Fatima, at Lourdes, at Medjugorje in the former Yugoslavia. Thousands of people have seen Mary from the dead. She's alive before them. This doesn't prove anything. This doesn't prove anything, unfortunately. So I come back to my central...
Because he wanted to run away from that debate with me earlier.
Bye.
Yeah, about the historical testimony of the crucifixion.
Bye-bye. You are interrupting the debate.
Come back.
Oh, bye.
Incorporate I'll just add another 5 seconds if I may, because we're interrupted by these rude people. Half a minute. No, well, that's very kind. Remember my central point. Where does it say in the Jewish Bible that the Messiah, remember, would die, and on the third day, not the second, not the fourth, not the first, not the sixth, on the third day? Nowhere does it say in Acts, does it mention 3 anywhere in Psalm 16, in verse 10, or anyone else? So with respect, my good friend here has not answered this basic point that I made right at the beginning.
Sorry.